Unmasking Anubis, the jackal god who guarded the dead. Tonight we tear away the ancient mask and face what still walks the sands. For over 4,000 years, Egyptians whispered his name with reverence and dread. Anubis, the silent watcher of tombs, the guide of souls, to most has a myth carved in gold leaf and stone, but to a handful of archaeologists, soldiers, and locals who claim to have seen something stalking the edges of the desert, Anubis is no relic. His shadow has been reported where no tracks should exist, jackal prints appearing beside sealed tombs, equipment failing under a crescent moon, and sometimes voices, low, guttural, carried on the wind from places long abandoned. This isn't just a tale of old gods. This is a trail of warnings, cursed deaths, and encounters that have haunted even hardened explorers. Tonight, we follow the evidence and the fear to uncover why Anubis still terrifies those who disturb the dead. The story doesn't begin in a museum or a temple. It begins with a single chilling moment when a man in the desert realized he wasn't alone. The sand was scattered with fresh paw prints, wide, deep, and perfectly spaced, as if a giant jackal had walked upright across the moonlit dunes. There were no caravans that night, no wild dogs for miles. The nearest village would have taken a full day's ride to reach, and yet the prince trailed off into nothing, swallowed by the shifting desert wind. It was 1882, in the Valley of the Kings, when a British-led expedition first recorded the phenomenon. They had been mapping forgotten tomb shafts under a blistering sun and had worked long past dusk. One of the local guides, a man named Hamid, stopped suddenly and refused to move farther. The others laughed until they saw his face. He was staring at the horizon, where a black silhouette, tall and narrow, lingered for a heartbeat before melting into the dunes. The men told themselves it was a trick of light. Hamid called it by the name Inpu, Anubis, the jackal god who watches the dead. To the ancient Egyptians, Anubis was not a distant deity. His presence was as immediate as the desert wind. In tomb after tomb, his black jackal visage guards the sarcophagi of pharaohs. Priests whispered his titles: he who is upon his mountain, guardian of the necropolis, judge of hearts. Even today, in the villages edging Luxor and Aswan, old men cross themselves or mutter a prayer if a lone jackal cries after midnight. Travelers through Egypt's western desert have reported odd occurrences for centuries. In 1911, a French archaeologist wrote of hearing scratching against the stone walls of a sealed burial chamber, though the dust on the floor was undisturbed. Bedouin herders speak of jackals with human-like gaits watching their camps from impossible distances. And in the 1940s, soldiers stationed in North Africa passed around stories of the black dog of the dunes, a figure that left no spoor except where men would later vanish on patrol. What makes these accounts chilling isn't just the consistency, the jackal-headed shape, the silence, the sudden disappearances, but the geography. Every incident traces a line across Egypt's necropolises, the sacred places where the ancients believed. The boundary between life and death was thin. For those who dismiss folklore as superstition, the setting itself is unsettling. Sun-baked valleys honeycombed with unmarked tombs, shafts that plunge into darkness, and carvings that seem to watch you as you pass. Even today, archaeologists admit that not every chamber has been mapped, not every legend explained. Some of the oldest workers refuse to enter certain corridors after dark. They say the air feels too still, too heavy, as if something waits just beyond the circle of their lantern light. Generations have come and gone, but the fear has not faded. The desert remembers every trespass, and for those who dare to disturb its graves, the guardian's shadow sometimes stirs again, just beyond the edge of vision. But something else was stirring beneath the surface. The birth of Anubis was wrapped in secrecy and whispers. According to ancient texts, he was not meant to be seen, not even among the gods. The stories say he came from betrayal. Nephthys, hidden in the shadows, conceived him with Osiris in an act that had to remain unspoken. The child, black jackal-faced, was left among reeds at the edge of the Nile, a place where mist clings to the water and the night hums with unseen life. The crocodiles did not touch him. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. Over time, the people of Egypt embraced him. They painted his form on temple walls and carved his likeness on the lids of sarcophagi. Candlelight flickered across his image as priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, their chants echoing through stone halls. To them, Anubis was a guardian, a psychopomp guiding souls through the afterlife. He weighed the hearts of the dead against the feather of Ma'at, ensuring balance and justice. In village shrines, clay figures of a jackal-headed god stood watch over the departed, a comforting reminder that their loved ones would not be lost. On the surface, it was reverence, a promise that no soul would wander alone. But woven into the rituals was a note of dread. The priest spoke of his mountain, a silent place where he prowled under a moonless sky, ensuring no spirit escaped his gaze. They whispered warnings, speak Anubis' name lightly, or invite his attention. At the great necropolises, families would leave offerings of bread, beer, and perfumed oil, not out of pure devotion, but to keep him satisfied. Even the most devout admitted in hushed tones that Anubis was not a god to be crossed. Picture the scene, a burial chamber lit only by flickering lamps, shadows dancing over hieroglyph-covered walls. The air is cool and dry, but carries a faint, earthy smell of age. Outside, the desert stretches endlessly, silent except for a lone jackal's distant cry. The priests move with precision, their linen robes whispering against the stone floor. As the final words of the prayer fade, the silence feels heavier, as if the chamber itself is listening. There was comfort in believing Anubis watched over the dead, but unease crept in through the cracks. Why did so many texts speak of his vigilance in tones of warning? Why did the villagers avoid certain valleys after dark? Behind the painted smiles of pharaohs and the bright pigments of temple reliefs, there was always the suggestion of a guardian who did not forgive trespass. The ancient world trusted him to keep balance. They also feared what might happen if his duty was disturbed. Then came the real shock. The first hints that something was wrong came quietly, almost too small to notice at first. A line of faint claw marks scored into the sandstone walls of an unopened tomb. A shepherd's flock near Saqqara, healthy one day, found lifeless and untouched the next, their bodies arranged in a perfect crescent facing west. Villagers spoke of jackals with glowing eyes that watched from the ridgelines but left no tracks in the sand. At first, these were dismissed as superstition, tricks of the wind and light across the shifting desert. But the pattern grew harder to ignore. In Luxor, a midwife told of a child born beneath a blood-red moon, its first cry echoing like a howl. The infant bore a dark birthmark shaped uncannily like a jackal's head. Priests whispered that such a sign had not been seen in generations, that it meant Anubis was walking among mortals again. The family hid the child away, but rumors spread like wildfire across the Nile's banks. Candlelit gatherings in back rooms became common, villagers murmuring prayers not of reverence, but of warding. They began leaving offerings at crossroads and river bends, desperate to appease whatever force seemed to be stirring. Artifacts, too, began to misbehave. A golden funerary mask recovered from a minor tomb in the Valley of the Kings was found inexplicably cracked one morning, though it had been locked in a sealed crate. A university researcher in Cairo reported her carefully cataloged papyrus scrolls rearranged overnight, as if an unseen hand had searched them for a name. And in the desert, Bedouin guides spoke of hearing footsteps behind them, heavy, deliberate. Yet when they turned, nothing disturbed the sand. The sickness came next. An entire excavation team fell ill with fevers that no doctor could explain. Their symptoms mimicked heat stroke, but they had been resting in the shade. One worker, delirious, claimed he saw a tall, jackal-headed figure standing at the mouth of the tomb, silent and unmoving, before slipping back into darkness. He recovered physically, but refused ever to return to the site. Suspicion began to grow. Among the locals, it was said that someone had trespassed in a place forbidden even to thieves. Perhaps a name had been spoken aloud that should have remained sealed in stone. Perhaps a heart had been weighed and found wanting. The archaeologists debated, was this a curse, a coincidence, or something far older than their tools and maps could measure? In the villages, fingers quietly pointed toward certain families, those who had disturbed ancestral graves, or the child born under the red moon. People avoided them in markets, crossing streets to keep their distance. Even hardened soldiers stationed nearby began carrying protective amulets, muttering half-believed prayers before night patrols. What had once been a harmless legend was twisting into something tangible and unsettling. The desert's silence no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. The wind carried whispers no one wanted to understand. That was only the first crack in the story. The fear spread like a sickness, creeping through the living world until it touched every home. At first, it was just uneasy glances across the marketplace, quiet words spoken over grinding stones. But soon, suspicion hardened into anger. Neighbors who had shared bread for generations now watched each other with narrowed eyes. A goat that wandered into the wrong yard could spark accusations of witchcraft. The livestock began to die in ways that made no sense. A shepherd found his flock collapsed in a perfect circle at dawn, their bodies unmarked, their eyes glassy and wide. Chickens were discovered outside their coops, necks twisted, yet no predator tracks surrounded them. The village elders blamed a drought, but the canals still flowed, and other villages upstream saw no such blight. Then the crops failed. Fields that had promised a strong harvest turned black and brittle overnight. Wheat crumbled to dust in farmers' hands, and date palms refused to bear fruit. The desert wind carried an acrid smell over the fields, as though something unseen had scorched the soil. Farmers stared out at their ruined land, unwilling to speak the name they feared might be behind it. The nights became unbearable. Shadows moved across walls without a source. Shapes flitted at the edge of lantern light, tall, thin, and always gone when pursued. Dogs that once patrolled the outskirts of the village whimpered and hid under carts. A few villagers claimed they saw glowing eyes watching from the dunes, twin embers suspended in the darkness. One hunter swore he heard padded footsteps following him through the date grove, matching his pace but leaving no trail. Gatherings grew tense. Men and women huddled in candlelit rooms, the flames throwing nervous shadows across mud-brick walls. Some accused the family of the Red Moon child, whispering that their bloodline had drawn the guardian's anger. Others said the archaeologists' digging had disturbed something sacred, and their trespass cursed them all. Arguments flared, voices broke, and prayers tangled with curses in the thick, smoky air. Even the skeptics felt the shift. A merchant who laughed at ghost stories found his storage jars cracked open one morning, every amphora of grain spoiled overnight. A young man who mocked the old rituals woke screaming, convinced he had felt claws on his chest in the dark. The villagers' sense of normalcy unraveled. Each incident another thread pulled loose. The desert itself seemed to close in. The wind no longer felt empty. It carried whispers, too faint to understand but too distinct to ignore. Lanterns sputtered for no reason, and even the stars seemed dimmer over the valley. Each night the silence pressed heavier on their ears, as if the world were waiting for something terrible to happen. And from there, everything grew darker. They fought back the only ways they knew how. At first, the measures were small garlic bulbs hung in every doorway. A line of coarse salt poured across thresholds, charms carved from bone and strung on fraying cords. The older women moved quietly from house to house, their gnarled hands tracing protective symbols on walls with ash, whispering prayers that had not been spoken aloud in decades. Their voices were low, almost trembling, as if uttering the words might draw attention they didn't want. But keeping silent might be worse. The men reinforced the old wooden shutters and sealed every crack in the walls with mud and pitch. They sharpened tools not meant for combat sickles, hoes, even kitchen knives, laying them beside their beds as if steel alone could hold back what prowled beyond the edge of the fields. Dogs were kept indoors, restless and whining at doors they once guarded proudly. The villagers' nights no longer belonged to sleep, but to anxious waiting. They began to mark sacred nights again, traditions long abandoned when the world seemed safer. On evenings when the moon was hidden, every lantern burned until dawn, their flickering light casting nervous shadows across the packed earth floors. Smoke from oil lamps drifted through the narrow alleys, clinging to the air like a fragile shield. No one dared to sleep on those nights. Parents pressed their children close, hushing every whimper, reminding them not to answer any voice that called from outside, no matter how familiar it might sound. Some believed sound itself could lure the guardian near, that it mimicked the voices of loved ones to trick the unwary. The younger men took turns on watch from the rooftops, though none truly wanted the post. They stared into the darkness, muscles tense, fingers white-knuckled on makeshift spears. Some claimed to glimpse movement at the far edge of the plains, a ripple of heat where there was no fire, a shape shifting against the stars. None of them could say for certain if they had truly seen anything, but every account deepened the fear. In hushed gatherings around kitchen tables, elders retold old stories they had once dismissed as superstition. They spoke of a time before records, when fire walked as flesh and tested the courage of those who tilled the earth. They said the guardian could not be killed, only warded away by respect, ritual, and a community's unbroken will. A few younger villagers scoffed, clinging to reason, but even their laughter was hollow. When the wind swept across the plains at night, rattling shutters and carrying the faint crackle of unseen flames, their eyes betrayed them. By the third moonless night, the village felt like a besieged fortress. Every breath, every creak of timber seemed amplified, as if the world itself were listening. They no longer spoke of if it would come, only when. And though none dared admit it aloud, each of them wondered whether garlic, salt, and whispered prayers would be enough when the fire finally reached their doors. Secret gatherings were held in abandoned granaries and half-collapsed shrines. There, men and women traded stories in hushed tones, comparing fresh claw marks on their walls, missing livestock, or the sudden fevers that struck without warning. A few claimed to have seen a towering figure at the edge of the dunes, a silhouette with the unmistakable curve of a jackal's head, watching but never approaching. The rituals grew stranger, more desperate. Bowls of milk were left at crossroads, and bread was buried beneath doorsteps. Farmers carried blades dipped in oil blessed by the oldest priest they could find. An archaeologist who had scoffed at local superstition was found scattering salt in a perfect circle around his tent, muttering half-remembered verses from a guidebook on Egyptian funerary rites. The fear had eroded their skepticism, but none of it seemed to matter. The crops still withered. Children woke screaming, clutching at invisible claws. Entire nights passed without the sound of crickets or the call of a single bird, as if even the living world was holding its breath. The villagers began to realize that every charm and prayer was little more than a trembling hope against something older, colder, and patient. One evening, during a new moon, a group of men climbed a low ridge to bury a sealed jar, an offering meant to appease the god they feared. They chanted softly, their words nearly drowned by the whisper of sand across stone. Just as they turned to leave, a shape rose on the horizon, tall, lean, black against the starlight. It did not move, but the air felt heavier, as if the desert itself was watching. One man swore later he heard a low growl carried on the wind, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They fled without finishing the rite, and when they returned at sunrise, the jar was gone, no prints in the sand, no sign of who or what had taken it. Only the faint scent of something ancient lingered in the air, a dry metallic tang that made their throats tighten. That moment opened a door that should have stayed closed. The first death was quiet. A farmer found face down beside his ruined fields, no wound on his body, his eyes wide open to the blazing sun. But soon others followed, a shepherd who vanished at dusk. His staff discovered snapped in two beside a single set of paw prints. A young mother, who died in her sleep, her face twisted in terror. It became clear that these weren't ordinary passings. The villagers began to say the guardian was collecting what was owed. In ancient Egypt, death was supposed to be orderly. Rituals preserved balance, the heart weighed, the soul guided. But when the balance was broken, when graves were disturbed, names forgotten, or oaths betrayed, Anubis was believed to hunt. Priests recorded these fears on faded papyri, that a restless soul, denied its proper rights, might claw its way back to the living, bringing chaos in its wake. The living responded with desperate measures. Bodies were pinned beneath heavy stones to keep them still. Nails were driven through burial shrouds to fasten the ka, ensuring the spirit could not slip free. Stakes were planted across fresh graves to mark the earth with protective spells. Villagers avoided funerals after dark, terrified that the guardian might be watching. Even the bravest men refused to walk past the necropolis at night, no matter how urgent their journey. There were whispers of corpses that did not stay where they were laid. One tale told of a worker buried hastily without offerings. Days later, his shadow was seen moving along a cliff at sundown, though his body was sealed in a tomb. Another story spoke of a jackal-headed figure pacing around a freshly covered grave, its claws leaving no impression in the dust. Archaeologists who unearthed ancient burials found curious signs, skeletons bound with rope, jawbones wedged open with small stones, and amulets pressed against ribs. These were not random practices, they were acts of terror, proof that even the ancients feared what might rise again. The villagers' dread deepened. If even the dead could not be trusted to remain still, then nowhere was safe. Fires were kept burning through the night. Mothers marked their children's foreheads with ash, muttering protective phrases older than memory. Each howl of a distant jackal seemed less like an animal call and more like a voice announcing another soul had been claimed. They understood then, death was not an escape. It was another threshold, one that could be crossed again under the wrong conditions. And if Anubis truly walked among them, he was no silent guide now. He was a hunter. Because some of the dead refused to stay buried. I saw it once, just once, outlined against the horizon as the moon slid behind a cloud. Taller than a man, its jackal head tilted toward the wind, ears twitching as if listening for a name long forgotten. The air turned cold enough to steal my breath, and the desert went utterly silent. Somewhere behind me, a door creaked, though no one was there to open it. I knew then why the old prayers were whispered, why graves were chained with stone and iron. Whatever they buried was never meant to stay underground.